For 20 years, Marcus Hale believed his wife had drowned in the black current beneath Ashford Quarry, where a burned-out sedan was pulled from the water but no body was ever recovered. He built a quiet life out of the wreckage, raising their son alone, filling his evenings with sawdust and silence instead of grief he refused to name. Then, on a gray Tuesday afternoon outside a downtown pharmacy, he saw a face he had buried 2 decades ago. Beside her stood a young woman with hazel eyes that matched his own, eyes he had only ever seen in a mirror and in his son's face. The woman he had mourned looked at him, trembling, and whispered a warning that undid everything he thought he understood about his own life. She told him not to speak her name because someone, even now, was still watching. If you want to know how a woman the world called dead survived 20 years in silence, stay until the end, because the truth she carries will cost someone everything. Welcome back to Velvet Storiez Tales. Subscribe now, because this story only gets heavier from here. Marcus Hale had come downtown that afternoon for nothing more complicated than a prescription refill and an errand list his daughter had taped to the fridge. He expected the day to end the way most of his days ended, sawdust on his boots, the radio playing low in his woodworking shop, dinner eaten standing at the counter. His life had settled into something manageable in the years since the accident that took his wife, Elena, when their son Caleb was barely 4. He ran a small custom furniture workshop on the edge of Ashford, the kind of place regulars found through word of mouth, and he had made something like peace with the shape his life had taken. He did not expect the sidewalk crowd to part the way it did, or for his eyes to land on a woman standing near the pharmacy's side entrance, a face that stopped the breath in his chest. She was older, thinner, her eyes sliding toward the street corners the way a person's eyes move when they have spent years learning not to be found. Marcus told himself it was impossible, that grief could conjure faces out of strangers if a man let it. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became. It was Elena, the woman he had married under a string of borrowed fairy lights, the woman a coroner had once sworn was identified beyond doubt, standing 30 feet away in a crowd that had no idea the ground beneath them had just shifted. Beside her stood a young woman, no older than 20, dark-haired, with a familiar set to her jaw and eyes the exact shade of hazel Marcus saw every morning in the mirror, the same shade he'd seen in his son's face since the day the boy was born. Marcus said Elena's name before he could stop himself, and the sound of it seemed to strike her physically. She flinched, grabbed the younger woman's wrist, and started pulling her toward a parked car before he'd taken a full step forward. He caught up to them at the curb, rain beginning to needle down. Elena would not meet his eyes directly. Her attention kept snapping to a dark sedan idling across the street, its windows tinted too deep to tell if anyone sat inside. In a voice worn thin by fear, she told him they couldn't be seen together, that every second they lingered increased a danger he didn't yet understand. Before Marcus could answer, the young woman turned to Elena and asked, in a voice caught between hope and disbelief, whether this stranger in the rain was really her father. Marcus drove them to the old storage room behind his workshop, a space crowded with reclaimed lumber and tools he couldn't bring himself to sell. For a long moment none of them spoke while rain drummed the tin roof and a single bulb swayed on its cord. The smell of cedar and linseed oil settled over the three of them like something almost comforting in its ordinariness. Elena finally broke the silence. She told him that when she vanished 20 years earlier, she had been carrying a child neither of them yet knew existed. The young woman introduced herself as Ivy, saying her last name carefully, like it belonged to a costume rather than a name. She explained she'd grown up believing her father died before she was born, a story repeated so often it had calcified into something she never thought to question. Only 2 weeks earlier, her mother had finally told her the truth: her father was alive, living less than a day's drive from where they'd been hiding. Marcus told them plainly that 2 decades of lies could not be undone by a resemblance, however striking. He needed proof. Elena agreed without hesitation, but warned they couldn't send a sample to any ordinary lab, because her uncle, Julian Crane, had people embedded in hospitals, courts, and private data firms across 3 states. The name hit Marcus like a stone dropped into still water. He remembered it from the earliest days of their marriage, when Elena's family made their disapproval of a small-town carpenter marrying into their world unmistakably clear. The story that unfolded that evening carried Marcus back 20 years. Elena had been born into the Crane family, daughter of the late Walton Crane, founder of Crane Meridian Holdings, an empire built across decades of careful acquisitions and even more careful public image. She had never wanted the name that came with the money. She'd married a carpenter most of her relatives couldn't find on a map, and endured her family's cold disapproval without complaint, because Marcus had never once made her feel like a consolation prize. After Walton died, his younger brother Julian took control of the company and, with it, nearly everything the Crane name still touched. 3 days before Elena disappeared, she discovered Julian had been siphoning hundreds of millions from the company's employee pension fund through a web of shell corporations. Digging further, she found documents suggesting her own father's signature had been forged across dozens of filings in the years before his death, a fraud stretching back further than she dared imagine. She decided to hand every piece of evidence to federal investigators, believing the truth alone would protect her family from her uncle's ambition. Julian learned of her plan before she could act. His answer wasn't a spoken threat, it was an envelope left on her doorstep, photographs of Marcus and Caleb taken without their knowledge. Proof he knew exactly where to find the people she loved. The family's longtime security director, a man named Silas Okafor, came to her that week with an offer that felt less like rescue and more like surrender. If she wanted her husband and son safe, her grief would need to be real in every detail, because Julian would never be fooled by mourning that wavered. A car resembling Elena's was pushed into the quarry and burned before it sank, and the dental records used to identify the body had been quietly substituted by someone loyal to the family. Elena told herself she'd only need to disappear for a few months, long enough for Silas to build a case strong enough to protect her. Those months became 2 decades she never intended to lose. Marcus asked her, his voice low in a way that frightened him more than shouting would have, why she never came back once she believed herself safe. Elena's answer came slowly. Silas had once tried to arrange her return. Before that plan could move, he vanished without explanation, and every channel she'd used to reach the outside world went silent within days. She spent 20 years moving through borrowed names and rented rooms, first through Nevada, then north into Idaho, eventually a small coastal town in Oregon. She kept a photograph of Marcus folded in a coat pocket, worn soft from being unfolded too many times in the dark. Marcus listened without softening. He told her grief he could forgive, but the theft of his right to know the truth about his own life was a different kind of wound. Ivy, who'd said little, finally asked her mother whether the same lie had protected both sides of the family from each other. Elena didn't flinch from it. She admitted fear alone no longer explained everything, that somewhere in the passing years, she'd simply lost the ability to imagine what a return might look like. Marcus asked more sharply why she'd resurfaced now, after so long hiding. In answer, Elena slid a folder across the table, its cover embossed with a small silver crown, the Crane Meridian seal. Ivy would turn 21 in exactly 3 days, and that single fact carried the power to unravel everything Julian had spent 2 decades building. Walton Crane, before his death, had structured a trust holding 51% of the company's voting shares, a controlling stake designed to protect it from exactly the consolidation Julian had since achieved. Julian had only ever held temporary stewardship under the condition that Elena had died without a legitimate heir. A hidden clause, one Julian believed had died with Walton, specified control would automatically revert to Elena or her biological child the moment that child turned 21, triggering a mandatory audit of every pension account the company controlled. Julian was, at that very moment, finalizing a sale of a controlling stake to a foreign investment fund, structured to close before Ivy's birthday made her claim impossible to ignore. Elena possessed only a copy of the clause, the sole original had been hidden by Silas somewhere in Ashford before his disappearance. Days before the pharmacy, she'd received a recording released automatically after Silas's death, in which he revealed the original document had been concealed inside something belonging to Marcus. Marcus felt the memory surface before he reached for it, a wooden toolbox Elena had given him the day he opened his workshop, a gift he'd kept for 20 years without ever suspecting it held anything but chisels and clamps. They drove back through rain-slicked streets in silence. When they arrived, the toolbox sat exactly where it always had, except the storage room had clearly been searched already, drawers overturned, the lock forced. Scrolled on the wall behind the emptied box, in handwriting none of them recognized, was a single line: "The dead ought to know better than to stop staying buried." Shaken but unwilling to retreat, Marcus called Priya Nair, a lawyer he trusted since college, the only person he knew with the expertise to untangle a trust this complicated. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from polite skepticism to alarm as the pieces fit together. Priya confirmed the clause could well be binding, but warned a photocopy would never withstand scrutiny from a company as well-lawyered as Crane Meridian. She suggested bringing in Caleb, whose career as a forensic data auditor made him uniquely suited to trace Julian's shell companies, even though it meant reopening a wound Marcus had spent years protecting his son from. Caleb arrived the next morning fully convinced his father had fallen for a pair of con artists preying on an old man's grief. That certainty collapsed the moment he saw Elena's face, the same features he'd only known from photographs kept in a drawer his father rarely opened. There was no tearful reunion. Instead, Caleb asked her, with a controlled fury that surprised even him, where she'd been during every birthday, every graduation, every night his father worked a second job just to keep the lights on. Elena didn't defend herself. She said only that she was sorry, and that she understood if forgiveness was something he could never offer. Before Caleb could walk away, something about the toolbox's base caught his eye, thicker than its dimensions should allow. Beneath a false panel, he found a single object, an antique pocket watch that had belonged to Walton Crane. No document, no legal paper, instead, a small brass key and a string of numbers he recognized as belonging to a bank account. He traced it to a safety deposit box frozen the exact date Elena was declared dead. Priya filed an emergency motion to force the bank to open it, and word reached Julian faster than anyone anticipated. Within hours, Crane Meridian launched a media campaign painting Marcus as a man manipulated by an imposter attempting extortion. Grainy photos of him and Elena splashed across local broadcasts. Long-time customers cancelled orders overnight. His accounts came under sudden scrutiny, and police searched his property on an anonymous tip. Marcus endured it with grim, practiced patience, understanding by then that Julian's reach extended further than he'd imagined. Julian himself appeared at the workshop days later, dressed too finely for a town like Ashford, running a gloved finger along a workbench like he was inspecting merchandise. He made no direct threats, only offered Marcus $20 million for a signed statement declaring the woman traveling with him wasn't Elena Crane at all. For one unsettling moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his reputation, Marcus felt something close to temptation, less about the money than a rage toward Elena he hadn't let himself fully feel. Julian made his first mistake in that conversation, referring to Ivy by her full legal name, a detail known only to Elena, Marcus, and Priya. The slip told Marcus exactly how long Julian had known of his niece's existence, and it hardened whatever resolve had briefly wavered. He refused the offer. Within days, a discreet paternity test confirmed what Marcus had already begun to accept: Ivy was his daughter, beyond reasonable doubt. Priya warned that private results alone would never sway a board loyal to Julian. That evening, Julian sent Ivy a private message suggesting her mother had never told her the full truth about the night the car went into the quarry. Rattled, Ivy arranged a secret meeting with him at the Crane family's downtown hotel, desperate to understand what her mother had left out. Julian showed her documents proving Elena had once been offered a place in witness protection and had declined it, planting the idea that her mother had, at least in part, chosen the years of hiding. When Ivy confronted her, Elena didn't deny it. The program would have required surrendering every piece of evidence she'd gathered and permanently losing any say in her unborn child's future, and she'd never been certain the handling official hadn't already been compromised by Julian. Marcus remained disappointed by the choice, but found himself beginning to understand how thoroughly Julian had learned to bend every system meant to protect her. Meanwhile, Caleb spent his nights combing through Silas's old digital records and found dozens of letters Elena had mailed over the years, every one rerouted to a storage facility owned by a security firm under Crane control. Julian had been intercepting his niece's correspondence for nearly 2 decades. In the final letter, dated a week before Silas vanished, Elena had written that she intended to come home no matter the danger. It gave Caleb a version of his mother he hadn't expected, one who had genuinely tried to return long before he was ready to forgive the years she hadn't. Priya, working a separate angle, tracked down the forensic pathologist who'd signed off on the original identification, a woman named Dana Whitfield, long since retired. Under careful questioning, Dana admitted the dental records had been quietly swapped by a superior before she ever saw the original file, a confession she'd carried in silence for 20 years out of fear for her own career. She agreed to testify, but only with a guarantee of legal protection from whatever retaliation Julian might attempt. With Dana's cooperation secured, Priya finally forced open the frozen safety deposit box. Instead of the original trust document, it held only an empty envelope and a single photograph, showing Marcus Delgado, the company's longtime CFO, removing something from that same box a full decade earlier. With Ivy's birthday less than a day away, Julian convened an emergency board meeting, determined to push the foreign sale through before midnight. Marcus, Elena, Ivy, Caleb, and Priya arrived together at Crane Meridian's glass tower, only to be stopped at the lobby, because Elena remained, on every official record, a woman legally dead for 20 years. Security formed a quiet, immovable wall in front of the elevators. Priya fought to secure entry using Dana's sworn statement, demanding the board delay any vote. Julian met them in the lobby himself, visibly amused, mocking Marcus in front of arriving board members as a small-town carpenter whose greed had finally caught up with him. It was Delgado, arriving unannounced and clearly agitated, who changed everything. He confirmed, unprompted, that he'd removed documents from the box exactly 10 years earlier, a fact everyone assumed would strengthen Julian's position. Instead, Delgado revealed Silas had asked him to safeguard the original trust document years before his disappearance, fearing correctly that even a bank vault wouldn't stay safe from Julian forever. He'd stayed silent for a decade only because Julian threatened to pin the company's entire pattern of fraud on him. What finally broke his silence was learning Julian intended to liquidate the very pension fund thousands of ordinary employees depended on, a betrayal he could no longer carry alone. He produced the original trust document on the spot, alongside verified copies of the paternity results, Dana's statement, and the intercepted letters Caleb had traced. The papers landed across the boardroom table one by one, and several board members who'd nodded along to Julian's decisions for years now sat in visible discomfort, unable to meet his eyes. The evidence left no room for doubt. Elena Hale was alive, and Ivy was the legitimate heir to a controlling interest in the company her grandfather built. Julian made one final attempt to force the sale through before midnight, but the moment Ivy's birthday arrived, his temporary authority over the disputed shares was automatically suspended by the very clause he believed no longer existed. Ivy now held the deciding voice over 51% of Crane Meridian holdings. Standing before the seat that had once belonged to her grandfather, she made her first decision as controlling shareholder, not to remove Julian out of vengeance, but to open the company's entire financial history, without restriction, to federal investigators. Julian was suspended from his position within days, facing formal charges of fraud, forgery, and obstruction. His empire dismantled not through revenge, but through the quiet weight of paperwork he'd spent 2 decades believing was permanently under his control. Elena refused every suggestion that she take over as CEO herself, choosing instead to hand day-to-day authority to an independent oversight board, insisting as her one non-negotiable condition that the depleted pension fund be restored to every employee it had once belonged to. Ivy wanted no part of a life defined by inherited wealth. She kept her voting authority but stayed focused on finishing school, involving herself only in the company's most significant ethical decisions. Caleb wasn't ready to call Elena his mother, and made no pretense otherwise, but he agreed to let her write to him again, this time with a real address and no intermediary, and found himself checking the mailbox more eagerly than he'd admit. Ivy asked her father, quietly and without real expectation, whether he wanted to run the paternity test again now that the truth carried no legal urgency. Marcus told her he didn't need another piece of paper to confirm what he'd already understood the moment he saw her eyes outside the pharmacy. Elena asked him for a chance to begin again, carefully, without assuming the lost years could simply be waved away. Marcus didn't slide a ring back onto his finger that night, and didn't pretend 20 years of grief could be forgiven in a single conversation. He told her plainly that the marriage they'd shared had ended the day the world declared her dead, and whatever came next would have to be something new, built honestly rather than salvaged. Elena accepted that without argument, and something in her posture eased, like she'd braced for a harsher answer. She asked, almost tentatively, whether she might come by the workshop the next morning. Marcus considered it, then told her tomorrow sounded like a reasonable place to start. A year passed before Ashford settled back into something resembling ordinary life, though nothing about it felt quite the same. Hale and Son Woodworks reopened under a freshly painted sign, but Marcus kept the old toolbox exactly where it had always sat, a reminder he had no interest in packing